Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'm flying solo today. Jenny Beth is out on the campaign trail, so I'll be delivering both the call to action and the Washington report. Let's get right to it. The House and Senate are both out and will not return until after the election. Now let's talk about deficit spending. Last Tuesday, the Congressional Budget Office released data showing that the U.S. government's budget deficit topped $1.8 trillion in the 2024 fiscal year, driven by higher spending on interest and entitlement programs. The data shows that over the course of the year, the government collected $4.92 trillion in revenue and spent $6.75 trillion, yielding a $1.83 trillion deficit. Let's talk about this for just a moment because this is very important. In the 4 fiscal years of Donald Trump's presidency, we spent the following amounts of money. FY 2017, which began a month before he was elected, we spent $3.98 trillion. In FY 2018, we spent $4.11 trillion. In FY 2019, we spent $4.45 trillion. Then in fiscal year 2020, the first year of COVID spending, when Republicans and Democrats got together and threw as much money as they could at the economy they had shut down that spring, government spending ballooned to $6.55 trillion. So we're paddling along, spending about $4 trillion a year for several years, and then all of a sudden we go boom and add another $2 trillion on top of the $4.5 trillion we're already planning to spend. But that was the COVID year, so it was understandable. Nobody had ever seen anything like that, and nobody knew what to do. So you can cut them all some slack for going overboard, right? Better to do too much than to do not enough and cause an economic calamity that would rival the Great Depression, right? But then, if that's all it was, you'd expect spending to come back to the pre-COVID levels, wouldn't you? Sure. Of course. Except they didn't. Not by a long shot. In fiscal year 2021, which began in October of 2020, months after we began reopening the economy, we spent, wait for it, $6.82 trillion, almost $300 billion more than we had in the previous fiscal year, which was the COVID year. Spending didn't even begin to come back down until the following fiscal year, FY 2022, when government spent $6.27 trillion, about $550 billion less than it had the year before. And then in FY 2023, we spent $6.13 trillion, again, a little bit less than the year before. But then in FY 2024, which just ended 2 weeks ago, spending increased again, this time to $6.75 trillion. And what about revenues during this period? In FY 17, we took in $3.32 trillion. FY 18, $3.33 trillion. In FY 19, it was $3.44 trillion. And in FY 20, it was $3.42 trillion. Are you noticing a pattern? Revenue is remarkably consistent over those 4 years. And even when they started spending money like nobody's business, revenues went up, but didn't go anywhere near matching the spending levels. In FY 21, revenues jumped from $3.42 trillion to $4.05 trillion. In FY22, revenues grew to $4.9 trillion. In FY23, revenues shrank to $4.44 trillion. But then in FY24, revenues grew again to $4.92 trillion. It's as if everybody in government just decided to recalibrate at a new post-COVID spending level where we're spending close to $7 trillion a year, but we're only taking in about $5 trillion. And nobody's got a problem with our deficit growing from $660 billion in FY 2017 to $1.83 trillion, 3 times as much in just 8 years. This is how you grow the national debt to $35 trillion. And if we don't change course within the next decade, the national debt will hit $50 trillion. Now let's talk about the lame duck agenda. On Sunday and Monday of last week, senior House Republican staff met at a hotel in Baltimore to spend 2 days talking. They got a briefing from 2 former members who were key committee chairmen on how to work with the Senate on reconciliation. More interesting for us is the discussion that was led by the floor directors and policy directors for Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader Steve Scalise. They talked about the lame duck session and what to expect in it. Obviously, the House and Senate have to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, which has passed every year for more than 6 decades. And these senior House leadership aides reiterated that the House Republican leadership will not accept an omnibus spending package in the lame duck session. This means they're going to have to be willing to deal with Democrats on some things Democrats want, because they're not going to be able to pass spending bills with just Republican votes, because there are too many Republicans who simply will not vote for spending bills. And if the leadership cannot get a bill passed with votes from the majority alone, they'll need votes from the minority. That's simple math. Both sides know it. So be prepared for the House Republican leadership to make some concessions to the Democrats. And when it happens, remember that it's happening because too many Republicans won't vote for spending bills. In addition, Congress is going to have to pass some kind of disaster relief supplemental spending bill. Don't be surprised to see funding for the rebuilding of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland in that package. The Farm Bill still needs to be reauthorized, but that's a heavy lift. So don't expect a full 5-year reauthorization to pass in the lame duck session. Instead, expect a short-term reauthorization bill, kind of like a continuing resolution for the Farm Bill. Just enough to get deep enough into the new Congress to let them write a new 5-year authorization. And then there's this. The Republican leadership staffers said they expect to have a discussion after the election about changes to House rules, including changes to the rules around discharge petitions, privileged resolutions, and the motion to vacate. Now let's go to the other side of the Capitol Dome and talk about the Senate GOP leadership contest. Last Monday night, Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee, chairman of the Senate Steering Committee, the Republican-only internal caucus composed of the Senate's most conservative members, sent a letter to his GOP colleagues laying out a series of reform proposals aimed at shifting the balance of power inside the Senate Republican Conference, taking power away from the Senate GOP leader and redistributing it throughout the conference. He did this against the backdrop of the upcoming leadership elections, which will feature a contest to choose the replacement for Mitch McConnell, who has served as Republican leader for the last 18 years. Though Lee never explicitly referred to his proposals as demands, taken together, they certainly offer a roadmap to winning votes in the leadership contest from the most conservative members of the conference. Lee's proposed reforms focus not on particular policies, but on procedure. In that sense, they are similar to the demands made at the start of the 118th Congress, that is the current Congress, in the House, by conservative Republicans who wanted to hold their votes back in exchange for dealing with Kevin McCarthy. There are currently 3 candidates for the position: current Minority Whip John Thune of South Dakota, former Party Whip John Cornyn of Texas, and Rick Scott of Florida, who's never been elected to any leadership position in the Senate Republican Conference, but who had the guts to challenge McConnell for the top spot 2 years ago. Thune and Cornyn have been campaigning for the job by flying all over the country, appearing at fundraisers for their colleagues and would-be colleagues. Thune has raised $29 million, while Cornyn has raised $26 million. Scott, meanwhile, is running for re-election in Florida right now, so he doesn't have the luxury of being able to fly around the country raising money for his colleagues. Now let's talk about Campaign 2024. There are 22 days left until Election Day, but early voting is going on all over the country. Make a plan to vote, whether in person, early voting, if your state offers that, or by absentee ballot. Please, don't wait until Election Day. You don't want to be stuck with an unplanned event of some kind that keeps you from getting to the polls and casting a vote in a timely fashion. This election is far too important for that. Now to non-citizen voting. Does the Biden-Harris administration really want to allow non-citizens to vote in the November elections? One could certainly come to that conclusion based on recent actions by the Department of Justice. Last Friday, the Department of Justice sued the Commonwealth of Virginia over the state's effort to remove non-citizens from its voter rolls. Let me say that again. The Federal Department of Justice sued the Commonwealth of Virginia on Friday because Virginia is removing non-citizens who are not allowed to vote in Virginia from its voter rolls. DOJ says Virginia's action violates the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Law, a federal law that, among other things, prohibits changes to voter rolls within 90 days of an election. In August, Virginia's Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin ordered state officials to conduct what he called daily updates to remove ineligible voters, including felons and anyone who is, quote, unable to verify that they are citizens, unquote. Youngkin did not take the DOJ action well. Quote, with less than 30 days until the election, he said in a statement, the Biden-Harris Department of Justice is filing an unprecedented lawsuit against me and the Commonwealth of Virginia for appropriately enforcing a 2006 law signed by Democrat Tim Kaine that requires Virginia to remove non-citizens from the voter rolls, end quote. Prior to Friday's action, Youngkin had announced that Virginia had removed 6,303 non-citizens from its voter rolls between January 2022, shortly after he was inaugurated, and July 2024. The action against Virginia follows a similar DOJ lawsuit against Alabama a few weeks ago, also for removing non-citizens from its voter rolls within 90 days of an election. Kamala Harris finally blitzes the media. Finally, kind of. Vice President Kamala Harris, who became the Democrats' presumptive nominee on July 21, almost 3 months ago, didn't just sit for an interview. She sat down with several different media outlets. She began the week with a discussion on 60 Minutes, then followed that campaign staple with a sit-down with the women of The View, a podcast called Call Her Daddy, SiriusXM talk show host Howard Stern, and then she topped it off with a visit to the set of Late Night with Stephen Colbert. She would have been better off had she not sat for these interviews. Let's start with the 60 Minutes appearance. The interview with CBS News' Bill Whitaker was taped over the weekend and was used for both the Sunday morning Face the Nation broadcast and the Monday evening 60 Minutes broadcast. But the interview was so bad that the top brass at CBS decided to cut the interview in between the two airings. Consequently, Harris was shown answering a question one way on Sunday morning and then answering the same question differently on Monday evening. For example, Whitaker asked, but it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not listening. On the Face the Nation broadcast, Harris was shown answering the question this way, quote, well, Bill, the work that we've done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region, end quote. Later on the 60 Minutes broadcast, Harris was shown responding to the same question, quote, "We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end." End quote. You'd think, after sitting with the big boys at 60 Minutes, a visit to the set of The View would be a day in the park for the vice president. Not so. Tossed an underhanded softball by host Sonny Hostin, the most underhanded softball thrower of all. Is there something she would have done differently from Joe Biden? A rather obvious question for a candidate whose strategic imperative is to separate herself from a president with abysmally low approval ratings. Harris paused for the briefest of moments before responding, quote, "There is not a thing that comes to mind. I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact." End quote. Let me tell you what Harris campaign strategists thought when they watched her say, "Not a thing." They were thinking, "Oh my goodness." This is a family show, so I've cleaned that up. The "not a thing" line is troubling to Harris' campaign staff and her supporters for at least two reasons. I guarantee you, her campaign staff had a briefing book prepared for this visit to The View. She's done so few of these sit-downs with the media since she took over in July that there's no reason to think that she didn't have an individualized briefing book prepared for this. It would have had a background page on each of the hosts. It would have had information on the show itself, the target audience, recent guests, and the like. And most importantly, there would have been a section in that briefing book with questions the campaign's communication staff believed were likely to be asked, and some suggested answers. Not only that, but given that this was The View, one of the most watched television shows among one of the key target audiences for the campaign, I would be surprised if a campaign staffer told me Harris had not sat with senior staff to do a mock taping of the show. We know from previous experience she once actually prepared for an important dinner by play acting it out in advance of the dinner, with her staff acting the part of the other dinner guests. If she's that concerned about appearances, she must have done a The View murder board or two, or 7, before the taping. And if she even looked at the briefing book with the potential questions, that question, or a version of it, must have been one of the first listed. What would you do differently? So, the fact that she totally whiffed on the question is troubling for two reasons. First, it means she can't remember the brief. She can't hold information in her head long enough to make it from her last prep session, which probably took place less than an hour before the taping began, through the end of the taping itself. That's worrisome. Second, it shows that even without the brief, on her own, she's not a very good political athlete. She's below par when it comes to the skill set needed to play at this level of politics. Can you imagine Bill Clinton being asked that question? Sit down and prepare for a 15-minute tour de force. Barack Obama? Get out your notebook. You're going to be a while. Kamala Harris? There's not a thing that comes to mind. Cue the Trump campaign ads. We're guaranteed to see them before the end of the race. Now let's talk about battleground state polling. The Wall Street Journal released a series of battleground state polls Friday, and Democrats went into full-scale tizzy mode. The polls show Harris with slim leads in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and show Trump with narrow leads in Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Other than Trump's 5-point lead in Nevada, no lead is larger than 2 points. Across the full set of 4,200 voters across the 7 states, Trump leads Harris by 46 to 45%. What's perhaps most troubling for Harris is the poll's internals. Trump leads Harris by 10 points on the question of who would be better at handling the economy, the top issue of concern. And the second issue of concern, immigration and border security, where Trump leads Harris by 16 points. Trump's lead on the key issues is a major cause of the Democrats' tizzy, but don't forget what we talked about last week, how the Democrats are outspending the Trump campaign by 2.5 to 1 over the last 4 to 6 weeks, depending on what kind of spending we're talking about. So when you combine the massive spending advantage with the polling deficit, you can see why Democrats are in a flummox. A quick look at the Real Clear Politics battleground state polls average shows another reason Democrats are freaking out. If the election were held tomorrow and each of the 7 battleground states went to the candidate who's leading there as of Saturday, Trump would win, and in a romp, because he's leading in 6 of the 7 battleground states. And in the one state where he's trailing, Wisconsin, he's trailing by precisely 0.3%. That would give him 302 votes in the Electoral College against Harris's 236. Trump's own internal polling, which the campaign released a few days ago, shows almost exactly the same thing. Trump up by 3 in Arizona, up by 5 in Georgia, up by 1 in Michigan, up by 3 in Nevada, up by 1 in North Carolina, up by 1 in Pennsylvania, and get this, up by 1 in Wisconsin. And here's the really important part. In all these states but one, North Carolina, he's at either 50% or 49%. And in North Carolina, he's at 48%. Now let's take a moment to talk about the Byron York theory of the case. Washington Examiner chief political correspondent and one of the smartest of all the Fox News contributors, Byron York, published a very interesting essay yesterday explaining the current Democrat freakout. He suggests that the natural state of the race is for Trump to be slightly ahead. Harris has had the chance to bask in 3 successive waves of massive positive media attention. First, when she replaced Biden as the Democrats' presumptive nominee in late July. Second, about 4 weeks later, when she got a bump from the Democrats' successful convention in Chicago. And third, in the weeks immediately following the September 10 debate with Trump. Each wave buoyed her numbers, so she popped above Trump. But each time her numbers settled back down, and each time the wave was smaller than the one that had preceded it. The switcheroo wave was the biggest of all, followed by the convention wave, followed by the post-debate wave. And guess what? There are no more exogenous events. There are no more conventions, no more debates. Nothing but grinded out 3 yards in a cloud of dust football for the final 3 weeks of the campaign. Of course, that could change. Something nobody expects now could happen. Goodness knows we've had more turns in this campaign than you find in the 24 hours of Le Mans. So this could change on a moment's notice. But as of right now, it looks as if the race has gone back to its natural state. And that has Democrats very, very worried. Now to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 90 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped last Wednesday. The episode features Jenny Beth's continuing conversation with Terry Schilling of the American Principles Project, who was also the guest on the previous week's episode. In episode 90, the two discuss America's woke military and how the woke agenda has negatively affected U.S. military readiness. Highly recommended. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now to the call to action. There are 22 days left until Election Day, and in many states, early voting has already begun. If you have not yet joined our action team, please go to marchtovictory.com to help get out the vote. That's marchtovictory.com. If you live in Georgia, our affiliated super PAC, Tea Party Patriots Citizens Fund, is paying people to go door to door. Most importantly, especially if you live in a battleground state and you know what they are, please sign up to help increase voter turnout. We'll send you directions on how to download our new app and use that app to reach your family and friends to be sure they get out and vote. You and your efforts could make the difference between victory and defeat in the November elections. As always, if you have a question or a comment, you can email us at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If you want me to answer a question on air, just add "for broadcast" to the subject line. We'll see you next week. Until then, be well and be active.